Okay, some 3-0 Blitz against Ali from Jordan. So we've got a Queen's Pawn game. Let's see what he goes for. Plays classically, Bishop E7, E3, simple development. Goes with A6, looking to expand on the queen side with B5. I'm going to keep myself on this dangerous diagonal. Let's get our pieces out. Now, that might look like a surprising move, but oftentimes in those positions, the dark squared bishop for white really just gets in the way of things. Okay, play a simple waiting move. He takes. You can simply develop. And in these types of queen pawn games, they can tend to be on the slower side. Knight drops back to E2 to cover D4. Let's exchange here. And at an opportune moment, we can look to push forward in the center. And we do have a bit of pressure along here, which I will play and take advantage of immediately. So his king and queen both being on light squares really opens himself up for tactics at this stage. Now he's coming off the G2, but my knight is actually protecting that square, so I can take on E6 because that is a key defensive piece right now. And I have a massive discovered check coming up. Let's give a check this way. He's going to have to block that, and then I can potentially just kick him with F3. This is looking fairly dire at this stage. Well, actually, if he pushes in, I can also just win like this, but... or I can win like that. So there's F3, there's D5. I can potentially give this check and look to pick up the knight. I can take on D8 as well. I mean, there are so many great moves here. I think maybe just the simple thing is just, you know, when you can take a rook, you take the rook. And now we just pick up the knight here, and I think that's going to be game over. We can also exchange pieces as well, simplify the game. And yeah, this is a completely winning position. So we can go in here, and go here. So we are now threatening the bishop, which is pinned. And not much you can do about that. We can just take with the knight. We can give a check, and we can start pushing our passed pawn. There's really not much you can do here. We'll just keep pushing. And even if he goes all the way to queening, it really doesn't matter because we've just got way too much material here. Alright, good game. Okay, so let's do a quick game review and have a look at that tactic in a bit more detail because I think it is quite instructive and typical in Queen's Pawn games. Okay, let's go to the critical point. Rook d8 is the double question mark move here. This looks very logical from Black's perspective. He wants to pressure the isolated pawn. He's also lining up his rook against the white queen as well. But what we really need to pay attention to here is this bad boy here, back on b3. It is an absolute monster, pointing at the king. One of the key things to be aware of in any chess position really is whenever there is a piece in your half of the board, you always need to be very, very aware of the potential damaging capacity of that piece. So if we just divide up the board into our two halves, we can see that Black has the b5 pawn here, kind of encroaching into white's territory. He has some long-range pieces that exert some pressure on my part of the board, but they're not really doing anything threatening at this stage. When we look at Black's half, we have this glorious knight on e5. We have this bishop here, and also the knight is covering some pretty key points. So just something to be aware of when you're playing your games is always have a think about divide things into halves. If there's anything from the opponent's army within my camp, you just need to look at it like a hawk. What Black failed to do here was really recognizing the sacrificial and damaging potential that this knight has. As magnificent as this piece looks from a positional standpoint, it's on a nice outpost, it's influencing a lot of key squares, but really those positional points are great, but really the most important factor is the sacrificial potential here, taking on f7. What is it that makes this sacrifice work? It's all about color complexes. Whenever you're playing chess, you need to be aware of the color complexes. We have two color complexes. We have light squares and we have dark squares. We can see that the black king and the black queen are both on light squares, and we have a light square bishop. This configuration of the pieces should make you quite alert in seeing that the king and the queen are on the same color complex. So we can imagine that if, the king was here, a bishop appearing on e6 would be forking the king and the queen, and black would be lost. We can see as we move forward through the game, knight takes f7. At this stage, it's the game is pretty much over. We take on e6 and we crash through it. Okay, so let's go to this key position and let's store this in our memory bank. We need to be aware of the sacrificial capacity of a knight on e5 jumping into f7. And we also need to be aware of the bishop on b3, the potential of it suddenly appearing on e6. This paired together with the fact that the queen and the king are both on light squares opens itself up for a lot of tactical possibilities. So that is why in this position, when my opponent played rook d8, that was the game-losing blunder because it simply left f7 undefended. If we just have a look at what else black could have done to keep the game going, he could have tried to increase the activity of his bishop, maybe something like bishop d6, could potentially look at neutralizing this absolute beast on b3 as well. So I would have probably considered something like bishop d5. You could potentially consider knight d5 as well, but something to think about as well is with your knight on your king side, you always have to be careful of moving away from your king, especially when there are already attacking forces in the vicinity. I'd like to keep the knight around the king just to make sure that my king is nice and safe. So I'd in this position probably look to play bishop d5 and look to try to neutralize that piece. Play might, continue something along these lines. We have symmetrical pawn structure. We've got a bishop versus a knight. The knight is great. White is probably better here, but you need to always be wary of moving pieces away from your king when there are attackers in that vicinity. Rook d8 is an example of one such move. We're moving away from the king, and there are already a lot of dangerously positioned pieces surrounding our king.